Excuse me. All right, guys, here we are. World War One. This will go quick. All right, get up in the corner here. All right. So as we talked about in class, we really tried to spend a lot of time saying, like, look, remember what you learned in ninth grade, the main causes of World War One: militarism, the secret alliance system, imperialism and nationalism, and how all of Europe was looking, all the great powers of Europe, excuse me, were looking for a way to increase their own geopolitical strategic position. And the arms race between Britain and Germany in terms of its navy, and France wanting revenge for the Franco-Prussian War and the loss of Alsace and Lorraine, Germany trying to make a bid for supremacy and challenge Great Britain's colonial empire, Russia wanting to exert greater control in Eastern Europe. And of course, during this time, you also saw, the Balkanization, where you saw the Austro-Hungarian Empire desperately trying to hang on to, under an authoritative regime, a multi-ethnic empire. And as you had a Serbian nationalist, Serbia was an independent country, shoot the Archduke Franz Ferdinand because of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's occupation of Bosnia, Bosnia was not an independent country, that a series of events went into motion where now this third little war in the Balkans, as Austria invaded Serbia to punish it for its state sponsorship of this Black Hand terrorist organization, all of a sudden everybody comes in, and by August, all the major powers are at war. The United States immediately declares neutrality. And we talked about, one was because of like the Wilson progressive idealism, the city on a hill idea that the United States will not get dragged into this war. Plus, at the start of the war, 1 out of every 3 Americans is a first or second generation immigrant. A large reason people left Europe was to get away from war and to get away from forced military conscription. And, the country is also divided. Irish people hate Great Britain. A lot of Russian immigrants don't want to see Russia win. There's a huge German faction that wants, that's going to support Germany. And, a lot of Americans are of like old stock, are very sympathetic to the British side because of our obvious similarities to Great Britain. And additionally, it's not real hard to portray the Kaiser. What did David Fromkin call him? Intellectually, emotionally, and unbalanced, right? It was very easy to paint the Germans as somebody that started the war, but nevertheless, Wilson says that we are going to remain neutral. The problem is that Britain has a very effective blockade of Germany. They've mined the North Sea. And while we protest that, it's okay. We let it go because we are able to trade so much. We loan $3 billion, do about $2.5 billion worth of trade, with the Allies. And of course, the Germans tried to stop that. Their answer was the shoot on sight, unrestricted submarine warfare policy. And after they sunk the Lusitania, killing 128 Americans in April of 1915, Wilson denounces it and basically says we will respond to a future sinking, with some vague phrase like we'll have the firmest of responses. And in 1915, the Germans said, all right, we won't sink any more passenger ships. But then after sinking the Sussex in early 1916, Wilson threatens to break off diplomatic relations, which is one step short of war. And in early 1916, he gets that pledge that the Germans will allow American trade with Britain. Additionally, remember, all of the propaganda is coming because the British cut the German transatlantic telegraph access. And all of these stories come in about how barbaric the German invasion is of Belgium. All right. So there is a big debate, and you see Wilson has a Eastern Republican faction, i.e. Teddy Roosevelt, that's really pushing to get prepared for war. Remember, we had our a very small force, only about 120,000 men in our army, while the Germans had 5 million. And so there was a push, despite huge democratic backlash, to build 50 warships and increase the army to 170,000. But Wilson is able to manipulate this in 1916. Because remember, the only reason he wins election in 1912 is because the Republicans were split, with Roosevelt bolting from the Republican Party as its conservative faction dominated and nominated William Howard Taft in 1912. That Republican vote was split, and Wilson wins in 1912 with 42% of the popular vote. And there's opposition to this, but he markets himself as he kept us out of war, and he squeaks by and wins. Remember, you've still got the solid South with the Democratic Party, and wins in 1916. You had outspoken pacifist critics of the preparedness. Wilson tries. He sends over Edward House to negotiate. Britain, France, Germany. He gets nowhere. The Zimmerman telegram was intercepted after Germany said, January 31st, we're going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Then in very early March, the Zimmerman note is intercepted by the British. It's leaked to the Americans, and then in the press that vague proposal of, hey, when it's inevitable, we'll go to war with the United States. If you help us out, you'll get back Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. And then also in March, you had the Russian Revolution, where the Kerensky Social Democrat government it's able to come to power. And Russia really was a liberal democracy. Remember, the Bolsheviks don't take power until November. And then after you have, it's clear that Britain and France can't continue without American help. They basically tell us that. The threat of what happens to our economic ties to the Allies, combined with the German aggression, they sank 5 American ships immediately in March of 1917. Wilson asks for and gets his declaration of war. And as we talked about in class, the rhetoric over and over again was about, making the world safe for democracy. We were fighting for a peace without victory. The mobilization is done with progressive-like efficiency. Excuse me. You have the war industry boards under Bernard Baruch, big-time Wall Street banker who's able to use all of his insider knowledge to efficiently coordinate this production. Herbert Hoover leads the Food Administration. Somebody really famous led the Railroad Administration. Somebody else famous, I'm sorry, I can't remember who, led the National Labor Relations Board. So the Railroad Administration, basically the government was going to set all the timetables on the railroads to efficiently use them for war production. And the National Labor Board, we weren't going to have any strikes. We were going to have government arbitration of any dispute. Remember, we had to raise $35 billion, 10 times what we thought it would cost for the war, and we had 4 massive Liberty loans, as well as increasing individual and corporate income tax. We had an army. Remember, we only had 170,000 volunteers in the first 6 weeks. So we had a Selective Service Act to eventually get 5 million people into the army, and we are 100% segregated. 400,000 African Americans fought in the war in segregated units. None were allowed in the Marine Corps. All right. When the war begins, you have the massive government propaganda effort with the Committee on Public Information, led by newspaperman George Creel, the 4-minute men that went around and gave all of these speeches. You had a ton of anti-German propaganda. We looked at that in class. Remember the Menace of the Seas, Halt the Hun. They're killing wiener dogs, right? Wisconsin makes it a crime to speak German on the phone. Liberty hamburgers are Liberty steaks, sauerkraut's Liberty cabbage. It was legal if you were involved in war production. The Secretary of Labor said, don't hire anybody with a German last name. The Espionage Act criminalized criticizing the war and interfering with the draft. The Sedition Act criminalized criticizing the government. Of course, Eugene V. Debs, we read part of that speech that he gave opposed to conscription and opposed to war. You know, he went to jail for it. Schenck was a Philadelphia socialist who was arrested for handing out pamphlets telling people to resist the draft. His case was heard by the Supreme Court, as Schenck said that, you know, the draft violated the 13th Amendment and his free speech was also being violated. And that's, of course, where we got the Supreme Court to rule against Schenck, saying that utterances permitted in peacetime can be restricted during war if that speech presents a clear and present danger, like yelling fire in a movie theater. Very good. Huge labor shortage during the war. Women took jobs, and it significantly, like as we said in the last review piece, sort of pushed Wilson over the edge to support suffrage. We had an uptick in the Great Migration. Remember, during that 20-year period between 1910 and 1930, it's like what, 1 out of every 7 people move, 1 out of every 7 Black people leave the South, as well as a significant increase in Mexican immigration. We get over there at the last second when it's most needed, because when the Sovs pulled out of the war and gave up 1/3 of their territory in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Germans put everything into the March 1918 offensive as they were exhausted. We plugged the gaps in the Second Battle of the Marne, and then took part in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And in just a couple of months of fighting, really, you know, one significant battle at Meuse-Argonne, which was 6 weeks, 50,000 Americans are killed in action, with more than double that by disease, largely the flu. And then the guns stop at the 11th hour on the 11th day, and there is an armistice. So now Wilson is going to do something unprecedented for a president, and he is going to go over to Europe to lead the negotiations himself. He brings only one Republican who he never consults. Wilson comes in with his peace without victory, his 14 points, such as self-determination, freedom of the seas, disarmament, and of course, the creation of a League of Nations. He is no match for the other members of the Big Four. Remember Clemenceau, when Wilson says, haven't you been to Germany? And he says, no, but the Germans have been to France twice in my lifetime. And Lloyd George in Britain says, we shall squeeze the orange until the pip squeaks. And, you know, when you take that Stanford woman next year in European history, like, Britain is beyond decimated. Remember when we read War's Held to the State, and like they kept dropping the enlistment height because, you know, the entire British Expeditionary Force was dead by the end of 1914. So they want to get some, and they, you know, this was 9th grade stuff. Germany has to pay all those reparations, except blame for the war, give up everything that they had, occupation of the Rhine, military occupation of the Rhineland by France for 15 years. They have to give back Alsace and Lorraine, and the League of Nations is the only part of his. You know, there are some new countries that are created, like Czechoslovakia and Poland. The League of Nations is created, and it includes Article 10, where the members pledge themselves to each other's mutual defense. But one great thing about America is checks and balances. The Senate has to ratify that treaty, and the Republicans won big in the election of 1918, the midterm. And Henry Cabot Lodge leads, even though he's a reservationist, which says we'll support the League of Nations without Article 10, there's also a lot of irreconcilables. And since Wilson decides to go, it's all or nothing, and does not want to amend the Treaty of Versailles, he loses, and he tours the country on a whistle-stop tour until he has a stroke in September, and he never recovers, and the treaty is defeated. And then after the war, the country is an absolute mess. You have basically 5 million guys coming back and looking for a job. The country goes into a recession, as it's very difficult to transition from war to civilian production. The farm prices that were so high during the war collapse. And there's also runaway inflation. There's a ton of strikes that take place. The Seattle General Strike, the Boston Police Strike, and we switch from hating Huns to hating Reds. There's the bombings. They mailed a bomb to Attorney General Palmer. They discover all the other bombs in the post office. There's a bomb on Wall Street, and there's a quick Red Scare, where about 6,000 people are arrested really without a lot of cause other than they're radicals, and 500 of them are deported. Fortunately, after Palmer um, incorrectly predicted a national uprising on May Day 1920, like it just kind of faded away. But the damage was done, and it really hurt a lot of sympathy towards organized labor as well. And it leads to, as we'll see in the next part with 1920, the prejudice against Sacco and Vanzetti, and the first ever restrictions on, I know there's Chinese Exclusion Act, like the quota system that's installed in 1921 and 1924. And that is a wrap. So next up, the 20s.